The danger didn't arrive with a crash or a scream, it followed quietly behind a shopping cart, unnoticed, already choosing its victims. On a mild afternoon, Sarah Miller pushed her cart through the aisles of a neighborhood supermarket, her youngest daughter, Emily, sitting in the child's seat and humming softly. To Sarah, it was an ordinary errand. To two men lingering near the entrance, it was opportunity. Mark Dalton and Eric Reeves had spent years drifting in and out of trouble. Both were on parole, both restless, both always watching for what they believed the world owed them. They noticed Sarah's distracted smile, the easy way she paid at the register, the way Emily clutched a small toy. They followed at a distance, careful not to be seen, memorizing the car, the turns, the quiet street where the Millers lived. By the time Sarah carried groceries into her home, the decision had already been made. The Miller family appeared ordinary in every way. David Miller worked long hours as a technician, steady and dependable. Their older daughter, Lily, was 10, thoughtful, observant, often lost in books. Their home sat on a calm street where neighbors waved and doors were rarely locked before dark. It was the kind of place people believed nothing truly bad could happen. That night passed without incident. Dinner was eaten, homework was checked, lights were turned off one by one. The house settled into silence, unaware it had been studied, timed, and marked. In another part of town, Mark and Eric prepared. They talked in low voices, convincing each other this was just a plan, just a way to get money quickly. They told themselves no one would get hurt, that fear was temporary, that they were in control. It was easier to lie when the sun was down. Just before dawn, while the Millers slept, the street remained still. Porch lights glowed faintly. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell quiet again. Mark and Eric approached the house they had followed hours earlier, their steps slow, deliberate. Inside, David stirred slightly, unaware that the normal rhythm of his family's life was about to be shattered. In the next few moments, the calm of the Miller home would be replaced by confusion, fear, and a chain of choices that could never be undone. The door opened, and the night let them in. David woke to pressure on his chest and the sharp sting of confusion. Before he could speak, hands forced him down, rough and practiced. A low voice warned him to stay quiet. The room smelled of sweat and gasoline carried in from outside. In seconds, he was pulled from bed, disoriented, his feet barely touching the floor as he was dragged toward the basement stairs. Above him, Sarah woke to a different sound, the creak of a floorboard that didn't belong to the house settling. Her heart raced as the bedroom door opened. Mark stood in the doorway, his face half-lit, finger pressed to his lips. Another figure moved behind him. Sarah reached instinctively for her phone, but it was taken before she could unlock it. Lily cried out from her room down the hall. The sound was cut short. Within minutes, the home was no longer a place of safety. It had become a series of locked rooms, whispered commands, and restrained fear. David was forced onto a cold concrete floor in the basement. His hands were secured, his movements limited. Every sound from above echoed, muffled footsteps, drawers opening, hushed arguments between the intruders. He strained against his restraints, his thoughts fixed on Sarah and the girls, imagining their fear, promising himself he would get free. Upstairs, Sarah and the children were kept apart. Lily was bound in her room, tears soaking her pillow as she tried to stay quiet the way she was told. Emily clung to her mother, trembling, her small hands gripping Sarah's shirt. Sarah whispered reassurances she didn't fully believe, trying to sound calm while her mind searched desperately for a way out. Mark and Eric moved through the house with growing frustration. They overturned cushions, pulled open cabinets, dumped drawers onto the floor. The money they expected wasn't there. Their voices grew sharper, impatience replacing confidence. Time felt like an enemy now, ticking loudly in the silence between rooms. Hours passed slowly, painfully. The sky outside began to lighten, pale blue creeping through the curtains. Sarah realized the night was ending, but the danger wasn't. When Mark demanded she get dressed and come with them, she understood they wanted more than what the house could offer. David heard the footsteps move toward the front door, then stop. He listened, counting breaths, muscles aching as he worked at his restraints inch by inch. Above him, Sarah was led out of the house, her mind focused on one fragile hope, that somewhere, somehow, someone would notice. As the door closed behind them, the house fell quiet again. But it was no longer the quiet of sleep. It was the kind that waits, heavy and uncertain, for what comes next. The drive to the bank felt endless. Sarah sat in the back seat, Mark beside her, Eric driving. Morning traffic began to build, ordinary life moving around them as if nothing was wrong. Storefronts opened, people walked dogs, a bus hissed to a stop. The normalcy was almost unbearable. Mark kept his voice low, calm but firm, reminding Sarah what would happen if she tried anything. She nodded, staring out the window, forcing herself to breathe slowly. Every thought centered on the girls and on David, bound and injured, waiting in the basement. Fear pressed against her chest, but beneath it was something else, determination. Inside the bank, the air was cool and quiet. The sound of shoes on tile echoed as Sarah approached the counter, her hands trembling just enough to look natural. Mark stood a few steps behind her, pretending to study a brochure. To anyone watching, it could have been an ordinary transaction. When the teller smiled and asked how she could help, Sarah leaned forward slightly. Her voice was steady, but her eyes told a different story. In a hushed tone, barely moving her lips, she said she needed help and that her family was in danger. The teller froze for a fraction of a second, then nodded calmly, as if nothing unusual had been said. The withdrawal was processed. The teller signaled a supervisor discreetly, fingers pressing a silent alert beneath the counter. Sarah took the envelope of cash, her heart pounding, and walked out without looking back. Police were notified within minutes. Back at the house, David finally felt one wrist loosen. Pain shot through his arm as he twisted free, gasping quietly. He moved slowly, fighting dizziness, every sound above him amplified in his mind. The house felt wrong, too still, too empty. When Sarah was brought back, Mark and Eric were already on edge. Sirens wailed faintly somewhere in the distance. They argued in sharp whispers, anger and fear feeding off each other. Plans unraveled quickly when panic took over. David heard raised voices and knew something had changed. He staggered toward the basement stairs, each step a struggle. Above him, the intruders moved faster now, no longer searching, only reacting. Sarah was pushed into the living room. She tried to speak, to reason, to buy time, but the men were no longer listening. Their choices narrowed, growing darker with every second. Smoke filled the air as gasoline was spread through the house, the sharp smell burning Sarah's throat. Lily and Emily were secured in their rooms, crying softly, confused and terrified. Sarah fought against her restraints, calling their names, her voice breaking. In the basement, David reached the door just as the first flames took hold upstairs. Heat crept downward, smoke curling along the ceiling. He forced the door open, coughing, eyes burning, driven by instinct and love. Outside, neighbors began to notice. A shout. A sudden glow. Sirens grew louder. The house, once a place of laughter and safety, was now a trap closing in on everyone inside. The smoke thickened quickly, turning the hallways into narrow tunnels of heat and shadow. David staggered up the basement steps, one hand dragging along the wall for balance. Every breath burned, his lungs screaming as he forced himself forward. Above him, the house crackled and groaned, sounds that didn't belong to any home meant for living. Sarah was forced to her knees in the living room. Mark's voice shook as he shouted at Eric, accusing him of losing control, of letting things spiral. Eric paced near the door, peering through the windows, watching flashing lights grow brighter at the end of the street. Panic had replaced whatever confidence they once had. Sarah tried to keep her eyes on the stairs, silently urging David to run if he could. Her thoughts clung to Lily and Emily, alone in their rooms, calling out for their parents. She strained against her restraints until her wrists ached, refusing to stop even when her strength faded. David reached the top of the stairs just as a wave of heat rolled down toward him. Flames licked along the ceiling, devouring curtains and picture frames, memories curling into blackened shapes. He heard Sarah's voice, weak but unmistakable, and pushed forward, ignoring the pain screaming through his body. Neighbors gathered outside now, shouting, pointing. Someone yelled that children were inside. Sirens drowned out everything else, a chaotic chorus closing in. Mark and Eric realized there was no escape left inside the house. They bolted for the back door, coughing, eyes wide with fear, shoving past the spreading flames. As they fled, the house seemed to collapse inward on itself, fire consuming what little time remained. David reached Sarah and fell beside her, struggling to free her hands. His fingers slipped, slick with sweat and ash, but finally the restraints gave way. Sarah collapsed against him, coughing, forcing herself to stand. "Girls," she gasped. They moved down the hallway, the smoke so thick it felt solid. David reached Lily's room first, pulling her free, lifting her into his arms. She clung to him, sobbing, her face streaked with soot. Sarah ran to Emily's room, calling her name over and over, fighting the smoke that blurred her vision. Outside, firefighters broke through windows, shouting commands, hoses thundering to life. A figure stumbled out the back door, then another, Mark and Eric, clothes scorched, hands raised as officers tackled them to the ground. Inside, time slipped away. David carried Lily toward the nearest window where firefighters waited. Sarah followed, her heart pounding, her arms empty as she screamed Emily's name into the smoke. The house roared around them, flames answering with cruel indifference. In those final moments, every second felt like a lifetime, every breath a desperate gamble against the fire that refused to slow. Firefighters smashed through the front windows as David emerged with Lily in his arms. Hands reached out, pulling them into fresh air. Lily was rushed away, wrapped in a blanket, her sobs breaking through the noise of sirens and shouted commands. David collapsed onto the lawn moments later, his body finally giving in as medics moved in. Inside the house, Sarah fought through the smoke toward Emily's room. The air was thick and dark, every step harder than the last. She dropped to her knees beside the bed, coughing, shaking Emily gently, begging her to wake up. Firefighters reached Sarah moments later, lifting her and carrying her out as the ceiling above them began to give way. Outside, Sarah screamed when she realized Emily was no longer in her arms. She tried to stand, to run back inside, but medics held her gently, firmly, as firefighters disappeared once more into the burning structure. Minutes stretched into an eternity. When they came back out, they carried Emily and then Lily's older sister, still and silent, their small forms wrapped in blankets. The medics worked quickly, desperately, but the smoke had already taken its toll. The girls never regained consciousness. Sarah's cries cut through the morning air, raw and unforgettable. David, barely conscious, turned his head at the sound, confusion giving way to horror as the truth settled in. Neighbors stood frozen, some crying openly, others staring in disbelief at the blackened remains of a home that had once been full of life. Across the street, Mark and Eric were pinned to the ground, coughing, their faces streaked with soot. Officers cuffed them as firefighters battled the last of the flames behind them. They didn't resist. The weight of what they had done was already written in their expressions. At the hospital, Sarah and David were treated for injuries and smoke exposure. Physical wounds were tended to, but nothing could touch the emptiness left behind. Lily survived physically, but she barely spoke, her eyes distant, holding tightly to a stuffed animal given to her by a nurse. By afternoon, the story had spread everywhere. News crews lined the street. Strangers brought flowers, candles, handwritten notes. The community gathered in silence, struggling to understand how something so ordinary could end in such unimaginable loss. As investigators worked through the ruins of the house, one truth became clear: this was not a random act. It was the result of choices, warnings missed, and systems that had failed to protect those most vulnerable. And for the Miller family, life would never again be divided into days and nights, but into before and after. The arrests happened only yards from the ruins of the Miller home. Mark Dalton and Eric Reeves were taken into custody as firefighters extinguished the last flames. Both men had long records, histories that showed warning signs missed and chances already spent. By nightfall, their names were everywhere, spoken with anger and disbelief. The investigation moved quickly. Evidence from the house, the bank, and witness accounts painted a clear timeline. Prosecutors described how the men had followed Sarah from the supermarket, how they planned the invasion, and how fear and greed escalated into irreversible choices. There was no room for doubt, only the heavy question of how it had been allowed to happen. At trial, the courtroom was silent when Sarah testified. Her voice shook as she described the ordinary day that led to unimaginable loss. David followed, his injuries still visible, his words careful and restrained. He spoke not with rage, but with quiet grief, describing the family they had built and the daughters they would never see grow up. The defense offered little explanation beyond desperation and poor judgment. The jury deliberated for days, the weight of the evidence and the outcome pressing on every decision. When the verdicts were read, guilty on all counts, there was no celebration, only a collective exhale from a room that had held its breath for weeks. Both men were sentenced to spend the rest of their lives behind bars. The judge spoke of responsibility, of choices made long before that morning, and of the irreversible harm caused. The sentence brought a form of justice, but not peace. The case ignited public outrage. Questions poured in about parole supervision, about how 2 repeat offenders had been allowed such freedom. Lawmakers promised reform. New policies followed: tighter monitoring, stricter reviews, fewer chances for those with violent histories. It was change born from tragedy. The debate over capital punishment resurfaced, louder than ever. Some demanded harsher consequences. Others argued that no sentence could match the loss suffered. The discussion filled news panels and town halls, but for the Miller family, it was distant noise compared to their daily reality. Sarah and David eventually moved away, unable to remain on the street where everything had changed. Lily grew older, carrying memories she rarely spoke about but would never forget. The family learned how to live with absence, how to breathe around grief that never truly left. Years later, a small memorial still stands where the house once did. Fresh flowers appear without explanation. Strangers pause there, reminded that evil does not always announce itself, and that vigilance, compassion, and accountability matter. Because what happened to the Miller family began with a glance in a grocery store, and ended with a cost no sentence could ever repay.